Have you ever found yourself wanting to dive into the world of quilting, but just don't know where to start? Well, you're in the right place because today I'm going to be sharing 5 must-know quilt blocks that will help you throughout your quilting journey. These 5 blocks should help you conquer any beginner quilt pattern that you find. I'm going to walk you through making each of the 5 quilt blocks, and then at the end I will share some quilts that I've made using those quilt blocks. Most of these quilts have free tutorials available on my channel here, so I will link those in the description of this video. I'm really excited to share the tutorials for these 5 quilt blocks with you, so let's dive in and get started. The first block I want to share with you is a simple 4-patch block. You'll find this block in a lot of quilt patterns. You'll find it in beginner quilt patterns and even advanced quilt patterns because it is a foundation of building a lot of different designs. You could sew this 4-patch together over and over and make a beautiful checkerboard quilt, or you could even just sew it together and make a simple patchwork quilt. It is a fun block to start off with your quilting journey. All right, so I already have my fabric cut, and I'm going to first show you how to piece this block together with just little squares, but I'm also going to share with you another method that a lot of people like to use, and you'll find in a lot of quilt patterns, that is strip piecing the 4-patch. Now, I honestly prefer just sewing the squares together myself because I feel like I can get it a lot more accurate this way rather than strip piecing. You may find when you're strip piecing long strips together. Now these aren't with the fabric, I just cut small pieces, but when you're sewing across these long pieces, if you haven't pinned it together, you can kind of distort the fabric. You can get a little bit wavy and you may not just be as accurate. Now, some people are really good at strip piecing, so I do recommend giving it a try because you'll find this method in a lot of different quilt patterns. But like I said, my preferred method is just sewing simple squares together. Now you'll see a graphic come up here on the screen, and it'll come up on the screen for each of the quilt blocks that I show that show the sizes I cut my pieces to. So if you want to practice these blocks, you can. Now I recommend just taking a quick screenshot of these graphics if you want to make the block, but I'll also try to put the measurements down in the description of this video for you. It will be helpful though if you can get a screenshot because on some of them there are a lot of pieces. All right, so starting with the 4-patch where all the squares are cut, what you're going to do is lay the squares right sides together. I have contrasting blocks, but you don't always have to have blocks that are like this. If you're just making a simple patchwork quilt, you could put them together in whatever way you want, however you like. But here I'm doing contrasting blocks. This would be a good foundation for maybe a checkerboard quilt. So you'd lay them right sides together and then sew a 1/4 inch seam. All right, so I'm gonna sew right along the edge of the fabric. I have the 2 squares lined up really nicely together. And I'm just going to go ahead and chain piece these, so that means I'm not cutting the thread between them just yet. Chain piecing them like this is really helpful because you have that thread keeping them together. So if you have these laid out where you really want to make sure they get sewn together, this is a good tip to keep your little 4 patches together by not cutting the threads. Now, this part is really important. When I press these, I'm going to make sure to press my seams toward the darker fabric. Now, if you're just sewing random pieces of fabric together, making a patchwork style quilt that doesn't really have a set design to it, you would want to press your fabrics in opposite directions. So if you have a 4-patch, you may want to press the top 2 blocks seam to the right and then the bottom 2 to the left. All right, so I have the seams laying toward the darker fabric here, and I'm going to take the iron and set it by pressing those seams. And pressing them in opposite directions was important because if you look, when you bring these together, the bulk of the seams are going to be laying in opposite directions. So it'll be a lot easier to quilt this quilt later. You won't have really thick seams to go over. Now you just lay these right sides together. And then if you see there, you can really feel where those seams meet up to make sure you get nice points there. So if you want, you could put a pin in, and that'll hold that in place when you go and sew across that seam. All right, so I'm going to sew right next to the edge of the fabric here, a 1/4 inch seam. Now, I just want to note to you that the sewing machine you have may not have a 1/4 inch foot on it like mine does. Now, if it doesn't, I would recommend getting a seam guide or even putting some masking tape down on your machine to mark where your 1/4 inch seam is, and then just line up the side of your fabric with that marking that you put on your machine. Now, when I get to the pin, I'm going to pull that out. I used to be really bad about sewing over my pins. I never had an issue with it before, but it is always a possibility that your needle on your machine could hit that pin when you're sewing over it and either break the pin or the needle or both, and they could fall down into your machine and break something. So it's always a good practice to pull the pin out before you get to it. All right, so now we're going to press the seam over. I like to finger press first just to get the seam going in the direction that I want it to go. And then there we go. We have our 4 patch. And I will, of course, press this seam with heat as well. But before I do that, I want to show you the strip piecing method. So I have the 2 strips here, and these are 2.5 inch strips by whatever length they got cut to, but they're 2.5 inches, just like the other blocks that we did. So we're just going to lay these right sides together and line them up. And then I'm going to put the edge right along my presser foot where the 1/4 inch is, and I'm just going to sew across here. All right, so we have these sewn along one side, and then we're just going to press toward the darker fabric. If the fabrics are close to being the same color, then just press to one side. I always like to press to the darker fabric when I can, because if you have a really light fabric on one side, you could see the seam through there if it's pressed to that side. All right, so I'm gonna go add some heat to this seam to get it to lay nice and flat. All right, so I'm just going to press with the iron. And now once I have it pressed nice and flat, we're going to square up one side of this strip set. And to do that, what I do is I line up one of the long sides of my strip set on a line on my mat, and then I let it overhang a line a little bit, and I'll use that line to straighten out one side of the strip set so that I know it is nice and straight. And now, because these strips are 2.5 inches wide, that's what I'm going to cut my segments to as well. So I'm going to line up the 2.5 inch line on my ruler. So I have a straight line lined up across the top, and I have the 2.5 inch line lined up across that side I squared up because I know that's nice and straight. And then I'm going to cut. So I have one little segment cut, and then I'm going to keep doing that all the way across the strip set to get the amount of strips that I need for, whatever pattern I'm using or anything like that. So 2.5 inch, and I can also line up another line just to help me know that I am nice and straight. And for this purpose, I'm just going to cut 2. So now you would do the same thing you did with the squares. You would have those seams are already going in opposite direction if you're making this checkerboard look. You would just lay them right sides together, line up that point so you could feel the seams there and see where they're meeting. They just like nest together really nicely. And then if you want, you can put a pin in. And then you would sew your 1/4 inch seam across there and press it just like with this one. So see how nice that point came in there with doing this method with having those seams pressed in opposite directions. It really helps you bring these together and get those really nice points. All right, so now that you know how to make a simple 4 patch, we're gonna move on to a 9 patch. I absolutely love making 9 patch blocks. You can make these chain designs in quilts, and it's actually just as easy as the 4 patch. You're just adding on some more squares. So again, with this block, I'm using 2.5 inch squares. Now, depending on the pattern, you may be using different size squares, so be sure to note what the pattern you're using says to use. All right, so I'm gonna show you how to chain piece this together again. Now, the first 2 squares, we are going to lay next to each other. We're going to take the square on that first row that was in the middle and lay it right sides together along the first square that was in that row. And we're going to sew a 1/4 inch seam across there. We're not going to cut those stitches again. We're going to pick up the next 2 squares. So this is the second row, and the middle square we're going to lay right sides together on the first square that was in the second row. And sew a 1/4 inch seam across there. Now we have the third row of squares, the first one and the second one. The second one's going to get laid right sides together on the first square that was in the third row. And then what do you think we do next? We are going to finger press these seams. So we're going to finger press all of them toward the darker fabric that is in this design. Now, again, if you don't have a fabric that is darker, what I like to do is press the seam in the first row away from the center square. And then in the middle row, I press the seams in toward the center square. And then in the third row, I press away from the center square. This like kind of pattern will help ensure that just like with that 4 patch block, all these seams are going to nest really nicely and you're not going to have a lot of bulk in your seams. So now we're going to sew the third square on in each row. And again, we're not going to cut any of the threads right now. This will hold this whole block together and keep everything lined up nicely. All right, and then we're going to press the seams to the dark fabric, or again, away from the center block in the first and third row, and then in toward the center block in the middle row. And then right now you're gonna have something that looks a little like this. It's not really laying out nicely because I'm holding it up, but all these threads are holding everything together and will really help you keep everything lined up the way you want to. Now, I'm going to press this block using my iron, get some heat on it so everything's laying nice and flat. And then we're going to lay the top row on the middle row, and those seams should nest really nicely together, just like with the 4 patch. And you'll put some pins in if you want to hold it together and make sure you get some nice points there. And then we'll sew across that seam. And then once it's sewn, we'll do the same thing with the bottom row. We'll flip it over, make sure the seams are nested nicely, put some pins in and sew across there. Then we'll be able to press this block and take a look at it all finished. All right, so we're gonna lay the side of the fabric up with the side of my 1/4 inch foot, or if you had to put a marking on your machine to find where the 1/4 inch is along there. And then we're just gonna sew across that edge. Now, sometimes my presser foot will want to push the seam in the other direction. Keep an eye out for that. You really want them to lay in the direction you had already had them, or it'll get really bulky and really be hard to quilt later. So I just lift up my foot, press the seam down in the direction that it needed to go, and then continue sewing. Removing the pins when we get to them. All right, and so I'm gonna finger press that side over. This will help kind of get it out of my way so I can do the final side. So I'm gonna lay that over and feel where those seams are. Put a pin in. I have my fabrics lined up together. Then I'm going to sew a 1/4 inch seam along that side. Make sure everything's lined up nicely. You don't want to have one of the fabrics kind of laying over too much and start sewing. You really want to make sure they're lined up nice and even with each other. All right, and then I'm going to finger press that over. Right, so here is how this block is looking. It is so beautiful. Let's go press it with the iron and get those seams laying really nice and flat. All right, let's add some heat to these seams. Now I'm pressing the seams away from the center. So this seam is pressed up and this seam is pressed down. You'll really want to follow the directions in the pattern you are using on which direction you press these seams so that the next block, those seams will nest as well. Often the pattern will let you know which direction to press those. So there is the 9-patch block. So what did you think of the 9-patch block? Pretty easy to make, right? And then I will show you later all of the different quilts you can make after learning how to bring this block together. All right, so for block number 3, I'm going to show you how to make the log cabin block. I absolutely love this block. It is really easy to piece together and it's actually a lot of fun. Plus, careful placement of your light and dark fabric can really allow you to make so many different designs using this block. It is so versatile and just so much fun to bring together. It looks really complicated. It's going to look a lot more complicated than the 4-patch and the 9-patch, but it is actually really easy to piece. Again, I have all of the measurements up on the screen if you want to screenshot it, and I actually put it together in the layout for this block so that it'll help you know where to place all those pieces if you want to make this block. All right, so here is the log cabin block all laid out. And we're going to start in the center with the 2 center squares. They're covered up a little bit with the fabric because my design board wasn't large enough to lay them out on all out. But the 2 center squares are 2.5-inch squares. They'll get sewn together first and pressed, and then we'll add on the next strip. And you just kind of work around in that way. So it really comes together so nicely. You could use thinner strips if you want. These are all 2.5-inch strips, but you could use ones that are 2 inches, 1.5 inches, whatever pattern you need. And you could keep building this out even farther than this block or make it smaller if you wanted to. All right, let me show you how to sew this together. All right, so first up, we have the 2 center squares here that are 2.5 inches. Lay them right sides together and sew a 1/4 inch seam. And then we are going to press the seam to one side. I'm always going to press my seams out from the center of where we're building this log cabin block out from. This starting one, I'm going to press to the darker fabric. So once I get it finger pressed away, I'm going to add some heat there. So there's how we're looking so far. And you can see the seam is pressed nice and flat toward the darker fabric. Now the next rectangle we are going to add on will go right under what we just built. Okay, so I'm laying them right sides together and sewing a 1/4 inch seam across here. And then again, I'm not going to try to press this up toward this seam. When I can, I'm going to always press away from the center because that's where less seams are. There's not a seam meeting on this block, so it'll lay a lot flatter if I press in this direction. So I'm going to finger press that first, and then I'm going to press it with the iron to get it laying nice and flat. Now I have a iron set up right next to me. It is a cordless iron. I absolutely love that iron because it's nice and lightweight. But if your setup doesn't allow you to have something set up right next to you to press these seams each time, and you would have to get up and walk away and go to your iron and press after each way, you could finger press this really flat and just press it all later if you want to. There's also little hand pressing tools or rolling tools that will help you get it even flatter than just your finger. But I know it can get tedious after each of these seams getting up and walking somewhere if you don't have an iron you can keep right next to you. All right, so here is how this block is looking. And this is a lot of sewing here. It's a lot more sewing than we did with our other 2 blocks, but I'm telling you, once you see the quilts that I've made using a log cabin block, you're really gonna see how fun this block is. All right, so we're putting on the next rectangle and we're working now, what is that, clockwise around. So just keep that in mind as you build this block. So I'm gonna lay it right sides together and sew a 1/4 inch seam across here. And if you are just learning how to quilt, you'll see that I'm not putting pins in here, but you may want to keep this in place as you sew. And if you need to, definitely do that if it makes you feel more comfortable. So I'm finger pressing that seam. And again, I'm pressing it out toward the strip we just put on. And then I'm going to use the iron to get that nice and flat. All right, so it's laying nice and flat there. And that's how my block is looking right now. And we're going to add the next strip on. So we started here and are just wrapping around. So if you wanted to put pins in, what you would do is line this up really nice. And I'd add a pin in the middle. And a pin over here maybe. And at the end, and then I would sew across, making sure everything's lined up nicely, and then remove the pins as you get to them. Okay, and then press that seam. All right, and what really can help me with remembering what strip is going to go on next is always laying the block out the way I started it, with the darker square to the left and the lighter square to the right. That'll let me know, since I just put this strip on, we're going to have a strip that's going here next. So that'll be a lighter strip. So it'll go right along there, lay it right sides together, and then sew that 1/4 inch seam. All right, press. There's how the block is looking so far. And look here, one of my seams wanted to flip and not lay the direction I was wanting it to. And if you feel through there, you can feel it's bulkier than the other seam. So I do recommend, if you have time, if you're not just practicing, if this is going to go into a quilt, pull those stitches out. I know nobody wants to have to get out the seam ripper, right? But I do recommend trying to get those to lay flat. It'll definitely help you out in the long run to make sure that the quilt is easy for you to quilt and doesn't have a lot of bulky seams. So I didn't rip out the full strip, just that section, flipped it over, and then I'm going to press it again so it's laying nice and flat. So there you go, you can feel through there, and now it's not bulky with a couple extra layers laying through there. All right, so we just laid this strip on, have it lined up to help me remember which strip is going to go on next, and then we have one going here, another light strip. So lay it right sides together, and we'll sew a 1/4 inch seam across here. All right, so press that seam. So here's the block coming together. And now we're going to go back to those darker fabrics. So we're on to this side here, lay it right sides together, and we'll sew a 1/4 inch seam across here. Get that strip lined up. The longer they get, the more you really have to pay attention to make sure everything is lined up nicely. And especially when you get to those longer strips, if you are new to quilting and sewing, it really is helpful to add some pins in if you need to. All right, press that. All right, and so again, I have it laid out like I had it laid out on my design board. And I know that the next strip I need to put on is on the top here. So this is my strip. And I'll lay it right sides together. And then of course I'll need to turn it to line it up and to bring it under the sewing machine. All right, and so all we have left is just one more layer around this entire block and it'll be finished. So let's keep sewing. We have another light strip to add on. Press that. So let me know in the comments, what do you think of this block? Do you think it's something that you could sew together if you are new to quilting? All right, so we're gonna put on the next strip. Line it up, make sure it's nice and straight across here. press the seam with your fingers and then press it with some heat. Getting a little too big for my area here that I'm sewing. It's such a big block. All right, so we're going to put a strip on next side here. And then after this one, we just have one more to sew on. Finger press that over and then press it with some heat. All right, and then our final strip will go on the top of the block here. All right, I finger pressed that seam and now I'm going to add some heat. And there you go. There is the log cabin block. This is such a fun block to show, and I can't wait to show you the quilts that I have made using a block like this. It is such a versatile design, and you can really make some really fun quilts if you know how to make this log cabin block. All right, the fourth block I want to share with you is the half square triangle block. There are so many different methods out there for the half square triangle, and I'm going to show you my favorite method, but if it doesn't work for you, rest assured there are so many different ways you can make this block out there. Now, the method that I like to use is a 2 at a time method. So I have 2 different fabrics here, and these are both 5-inch squares. I have contrasting fabrics because that is really what helps bring the half square triangle design together. When you know how to make the half square triangle, there are so many patterns that you can make with this block and just this block. Now, if you remember back to the beginning of this video, there was a gorgeous quilt behind me, and it is a scrappy quilt that has a ton of half square triangles in it. So once you know how to make this block, you could make that quilt. Now you might notice here that I have a line drawn from corner to corner on the back of one of these squares. I have it on the lighter square because that makes it really easy to see. We're gonna lay these 2 squares right sides together. So the pretty fabric's going to be facing together. Get it lined up nicely. And then what we are going to do is we're going to sew a 1/4 inch away from that line. So you're going to want to line up the side of your presser foot right along that line. Now, if your sewing machine does not have a 1/4 inch foot on it, what you can do is measure a 1/4 inch away from this line and draw a line there. That's where you're going to sew. And then you're going to do that on the other side as well, and I'll show you why. So I got my foot lined right up against that line, and I'm going to sew right across there. All right, it might be hard to see, but I have a row of stitches there, a 1/4 inch away from that line. And then I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. And again, if your foot is not a 1/4 inch foot on your sewing machine, measure away from that center line and draw a line and then sew across it. All right, and see how this is kind of wavy through here? It might be hard to pick up on camera, but it's kind of wavy. So after I do this sewing, I like to press this. One of the things is when you're going across the diagonal fabric like this, the fabric is really stretchy through there, so it can get warped and get kind of out of whack. So part of the reason I like to use this 2 at a time method It's because I sized the block a little bit larger than what I need to, so that if my sewing gets crazy and out of whack, I'm gonna trim this block down to the size I need either way. So it kind of gives me a little buffer for if things get wonky on these bias seams here. All right, so check this out. I pressed this block now and it's laying a lot flatter through here. So it'll definitely help you out if you take the time to press this flat after sewing along that diagonal line. So now the next step is we're going to cut along that diagonal line. So corner to corner, if you had to draw some other lines, we're cutting across this middle one. So right between those stitches. All right, so now we have two triangles here, and what we're going to do is press toward that darker fabric. So I'm gonna finger press first. If you don't normally finger press, I highly recommend doing it here because again, that's a bias seam there and it can get really stretchy and wonky. We are gonna trim these down to size, but pressing this really helps get that seam going. And you can do it a little more gently and make sure things aren't getting more out of whack. So I'm gonna add some heat to these from the iron to get it laying nice and flat. All right, so there are the half square triangles so far, laying nice and flat, but you can see here you have these what I call dog ears sticking out. And when you're sewing these together, it can get kind of wonky where, you know, it's sticking out and you quite don't have a straight line to sew up against. But these also may not be to the final size you need depending on your seam allowance and all that. So I'm trimming these down to 4.5 inch half square triangles. So here's the first one I'm going to trim down. And this is a 4.5 inch square that has grips on the bottom and diagonal lines that line right up with my seam. So once I get it lined up, I can just trim off any excess around here. There likely won't be a lot here. This gets pretty close to size. All right, so then we have our perfect half square triangle that is 4.5 inches. So we had two here so we can trim them both up. All right, so there are the two half square triangles. And again, you'll be able to make so many different quilts after you learn how to make this block. All right, so the fifth block I want to share with you is the Flying Geese block. I have become obsessed with the Flying Geese block recently, and I'm going to explain to you why. At first, when I first had to make the Flying Geese block for some patterns, I absolutely hated it. The Flying Geese block was so hard for me to make. It would get so wonky. I never got it to size right, and I just struggled with it. And after doing some research, I figured out why it was causing me so much trouble. A lot of the methods out there for bringing the Flying Geese block together give you some bias seams along the outside edge of the block, and that makes it really hard to keep it nice and even. With this cutting method that I'm going to show you on the graphic, it makes it so that this block comes together a lot easier and there are no bias edges along the outside of the block. So for the inner part of the Flying Geese, you're going to cut this 7.5 inch square and then you cut it along the diagonals twice. Now, the stretchy edges of this block are here along the inner edges where we cut. But this bottom edge here is nice and solid. It isn't as stretchy as here. And then for the kind of background of the Flying Geese or the triangles that are going to end up on the outside here, we're cutting 4.5 inch squares and then cutting it on the diagonal once. So that means that that stretchy seam is here in the center where we cut, but it's solid along these outer edges. So this method of cutting does give you the opportunity to make this block 4 times. So you'll end up with 4 flying geese blocks. So we're going to use one of these larger triangles cut from the 7.5 inch square. And then we're going to use 2 of those smaller background squares cut from the 4.5 inch square. So this is how the flying geese block will come together. So the first thing we're going to do is sew one side on. So we're lining up on one corner, we're lining up a straight edge along here, and then those bias edges are coming together. So sew carefully along there. Because we have 2 biases together, it can get really stretchy. But again, these are sized larger the way I show how to cut them, so it gives you a lot of room to square this up to size. Now, I do on my blog have cutting instructions for 4 different sizes of flying geese, and I'll share a link to that in the description of this video. So I'm finger pressing that seam. So there, it's all laying nice and flat, and then we'll put the other side on. And then we will press that over and add some heat to get it pressed nice and flat. All right, and so those biases are in here, but everything along the outside is nice and solid now. There's no stretching, so when you sew this block to other blocks, you're not gonna get more stretching. Once you trim this down to size, it's not gonna get all warped on you anymore. And that's why I love this method and why it has worked for me over and over. All right, so now we're going to trim this down to size. This is going to be 6.5 inches by 3.5 inches. And I'm lining up these lines here on the seams so that I get it trimmed up nice and perfect. And up here is a 1/4 inch that is going to be left over above that point. That is for seam allowance later when we sew this block to another one so that we keep a nice point there. So I'm going to trim along all sides, just kind of like with the half square triangle. All right, so there is the flying geese block. I'm gonna sew one more of these together since I have enough for 4 already cut, because I really wanna show you why it's so important to have that 1/4 inch left over at the top of that flying geese block. So let's get this sewn. All right, so there it is all sewn but not trimmed down yet. All right, so now I have 2 flying geese blocks trimmed down to size, and they both have that 1/4 inch along the top there. Now, when I sew these together, you'll see how making sure you have that 1/4 inch at the top will help you get that point nice and perfect. Now, I recommend when you can to sew these blocks together where the point is facing up. And that is because when you sew across here, you'll be able to see that you're not sewing inside of this point. You'll see where the threads come together. If you sew over here accidentally, when you open this block up and press, you won't have the point there. So keep that in mind. I'm going to sew a 1/4 inch seam across here. And when I get to that point, I'm going to make sure my needle goes just inside of that meeting of all the threads. So let's see how we did. See how you have that nice point there now, because we took the time to make sure we had a 1/4 inch seam above that point. And when we sewed, we made sure that we went just inside of it so that we can see the point there. All right, so that is block number 5, the Flying Geese block. All right, so now I have shared how to make all 5 of the must-know quilt blocks for a beginner quilter. And now I'm going to show you all the quilts you can make after knowing how to make these 5 blocks. All right, so let's take a look at some of the quilts that utilize these 5 must-know quilt blocks. Let's start with the 4-patch. So can you spot the 4 patches in this quilt? There are actually 2 different 4-patch blocks in this quilt. You'll see one in the center of the sawtooth star, and then one in the center of the square in a square block. Now, the sawtooth star may look really hard to a beginner quilter, but what is really fun about this sawtooth star block is that the points are made up from a Flying Geese block, and you just learned how to make one of those. And then when you bring this sawtooth star block together, it's actually a sort of 9-patch. There is a row of 3 blocks, a row of 3 blocks, and then a final row of 3 blocks. And you know how to make a 9-patch, so it comes together very much like some of the blocks we've made here today. All right, so let's take a look at this quilt here. This quilt has a 9-patch in it. And the 9-patch, you see here, 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 and here, they're all made into an even larger 9-patch, and it gives a fun chain design to this quilt. But what other block can you maybe see in this quilt? Yep, there is a log cabin block that makes up the house. And then we also have a really huge Flying Geese block that makes up the roof to the house. So I want to show you another log cabin quilt just so you can see how that block can really give you a completely different look. So this quilt is made up of some log cabin blocks, and it makes a big, huge star. This is all log cabin blocks. So I want to go back to that 4-patch block. I'm going to share another quilt with you that has 4 patches in it, but it does have a few more blocks that I didn't share with you today in it, but I just want to give you an idea of how that block can show up in other quilts. So this quilt has 4 patches that make up kind of a chain design as well. So it's 4 patches that come together to make a larger 9-patch. And then this quilt also has a sawtooth star block that is made with the Flying Geese again. But this one, unlike the first one I showed you, doesn't have a 4-patch in the center of it. All right, and then the 9-patch block shows up in this quilt. Can you see where it is? So the 9-patch is over here, and the other block that helps make up this quilt is a snowball block that is over here. I'll link to this quilt because I really think if you can make the half square triangle block, you can make the snowball block, and I show you how to do it in the sew along for this quilt. All right, so let's take a look at the half square triangle. The half square triangle is used to make this quilt here. It is used to make the quilt behind me along with some other blocks in there. The half square triangle is used to make the rain in this amazing quilt. And the half square triangle is used to make this quilt here. It is just a very large half square triangle. All right, and finally, let's look at the Flying Geese block. You'll find the flying geese in this quilt here. It's not all the way finished yet. Sorry about that. And then there are 4 different flying geese sizes in the quilt here. So let me know in the comments which quilt you like the best and would love to make. Again, I will link to any videos on these quilts that I have, and I'll walk you through making them. So now it's your turn. I encourage you to try making these 5 different quilt blocks. And if you do, I would love for you to share them with me on my Facebook page. I would love to take a look at what you make. Now don't forget to hit the like button if you enjoyed watching this video, and subscribe to my channel for more quilting tutorials. Happy quilting! And I look forward to sewing with you again in the next video. Bye!